We're so delighted that we're finally at this day. We've been anticipating being with you. Those of us who've had the opportunity to read Hope, a user's manual, have been storing up questions and thoughts, and we're so glad this day is here. I feel like a ding dong because I say every time you write that I think this is your best book. I thought The Art of Improv was pretty darn amazing, and I loved Hope in the Suburbs as well. And I think you have other fans on this call. I hope you see familiar faces and names. And if not, I'm so pleased to introduce you to a small portion of the Presbyterian of Wabash Valley. You've been in person and spoken with and led workshops in our Presbytery and at Sunnyside. In South Bend, and members of the Presbytery of Southeastern Illinois are co-hosting this event as well. And we're delighted that you could be with us today.
Thank you.
Our format typically is that we let you curate this space for in whatever way you wish. We typically end close to the hour mark. We're in 2 time zones, so we avoid at this point saying what hour it is for fear of messing up people's heads. We invite people to chew on screen if they feel comfortable doing that, because lunch is in the title of our time together. And then after we sort of formally invite people to feel free to move on at the top of the hour, we linger in the narthex for a little bit if you have a minute or two, for people who want to say, are you that MaryAnn McKibben Dana? Do you have somebody by that name? You know, that sort of thing they want to ask in a smaller group, or you know, people who are intimidated by having 15 people on a call. So we're glad you're here. Take it away. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, one of the questions I get a lot is, are you related to Bill McKibben, the environmental writer? And I just say, oh yes, he's my Uncle Bill. But as far as I know, we'd have to go back quite a ways to find a common ancestor, but I like to claim his work. He's been quite prolific in the world, and it's been really fun to talk to groups. I'm just beginning to do that, so this is probably just, I can count on one hand at this point because the book just came out a couple months ago. I was in Fort Worth doing a series of sermons at First Presbyterian Fort Worth a couple of weeks ago, and did a Q&A, although it was an in-person one, and that is one of the first times I've talked with a group around these things. And maybe I'll just throw this in there to get us started, but I'm really interested in your thoughts, your comments and questions, and especially your pushback, because what I tried to do with the book is not, I mean, I call it a user's manual, but as you can see, it's not really a step 1, step 2, step 3. It's really, somebody described it as different facets, right? Looking at a topic from a lot of different angles. And so that is kind of what I tried to do. But what happens when you do that is people look at it differently. And so I really want to open this up to conversation. And so in that vein, I want to ask first, the thing that got the most heat at this Q&A that I did in Fort Worth was around the idea of toxic positivity. And there was one person in particular who was really pushing back on that idea. How can positivity be toxic? And he talked specifically about a person that he worked with. And he said, this is the most positive person, and it's totally genuine. And he said, when I first met this person, I was really like suspicious of how sunny his disposition was. And yet the more I work with this person, it rubs off on me, and it's a contagious kind of positivity. And we had some conversation around that, but I want to just throw that out to you all first, because that's one of the things that really grabbed hold of this group, and they were really kind of chewing on is what is so toxic about positivity? Or how do we tell the difference between positivity that really moves us somewhere and something that gets in our way? So I want to throw that question out there and see what kind of ideas we have here on this call around that topic. And feel free to just take yourself off mute, and if you want to, if we get to talking over each other, we can do hands, but otherwise, yeah, I invite anybody to jump right in.
MaryAnn, I think genuine positivity is a gift in a lot of ways when it doesn't leave room for another response, is where I think the toxicity starts to set in. Here's an example. I love my family. Oh, we're recording. I know some people. I have a friend who's been going through a lot lately. Not to itemize it, but there's a lot going on. And this person's family members persist in saying, God's got this, you've got this, every cloud has a silver lining, doors, windows, all those genuinely meant phrases, but there's no room for this is flipping hard. And I think that's what's toxic in that case.
I love the framing of it as there's enough space, like a spaciousness there. I saw Joel take himself off mute. I don't know if that's because you're ready to hop in, but please do if you're got some thoughts here.
Yeah, thanks. Generally, I like to echo what Jennifer says. This is no exception. As a recovering evangelical, I'm somebody who has experienced congregations in which lament is not an option. And I think the identifying of toxic positivity is so life-giving because it identifies that there is time when lament is the only option, and in fact, the most God-honoring option. To find some sort of positivity it's not what Jeremiah did when Jerusalem was razed to the ground, right? And so I think naming that as toxic, maybe it's provocative, but I think it's the right kind of provocative. No, the feedback I have for that is not toxically positive, but very positive.
Thanks. Rebecca? I'm just calling on people who are off mute, and so if you don't want to be acknowledged, make sure you're muted. But Rebecca, did you want to jump in here?
Sure. Hi, MaryAnn.
Hi.
So part of what I experience as toxic positivity is what you have framed as the distinction between optimism and hope. In that optimism is kind of generally around us, right? It says the world will be better. And it's what Jennifer was talking about with those aphorisms that we throw out to each other in an effort to be comforting. Whereas if we think about the toxicity of positivity, it doesn't really dwell in relationship. You talk about hope being together we make the world better. In other words, we invest in each other in ways that sort of superficial optimism doesn't allow. And the toxicity is the lack of investment, I think, in that we seek relationship, and it's toxic not to have that relationship as we move forward together.
That's well said. Yeah, as we were talking in that gathering a couple of weeks ago, I hadn't even thought about this as I was writing that section. And the phrase toxic positivity is not, I didn't come up with it. I quote, I think it was Susan George in that section, the psychologist who does a lot of work in this. And she says how she understands it is and I can't remember if this quote made it into the book, but like when my comfort becomes more important than your reality. Like that's often when we rely on those phrases, those tropes. But I hadn't thought about this aspect of toxic positivity and just looking at the word toxic, right? And that even things that are good for us can reach toxic levels if there's too much. I mean, and Jennifer's comment and to some extent Rebecca's and Joel's kind of hint at this too, that it becomes toxic. It's not that positivity is in and of itself toxic, but there's a too muchness that crowds out the spaciousness that Jennifer was lifting up of like, and I think about this all the time, and I don't know if we have, I imagine we have, I know we have teaching elders here, and there may be some ruling elders or, you know, and some, I know some middle governing execs here too, but I think what makes this hard is your positivity can come across to someone else as too much, right? And there are some of us who are still, you know, I mean, we've been through a really tough few years together on our planet, let alone, you know, here. And some of us still need to be in that place of lament and just kind of what has changed, and others are not there. And maybe they genuinely aren't there. Maybe they've done that work and they're ready to move into something else. And so holding all of it together, I mean, I just think it gets very complicated because some people are ready to move from, I mean, this is Brueggemann's stuff too, right? Of orientation, disorientation, and new orientation or reorientation. And we're not all in the same place at the same time. I mean, I think Joel is absolutely right that culturally we are not just an evangelical culture, but kind of American culture is very like, let's do it, you know, and that's great if you've genuinely moved through those other phases, but when you haven't, you're kind of shortcutting some things. So it's just hard to hold it. I mean, I'm curious, you know, we don't have to talk the whole time about this topic, but it was the place that had the most heat, you know, in a good way. But what do you do when a congregation is in all those different places, or a presbytery or a synod, you know? How do you hold all those different places together? Maybe a rhetorical question, but you know, if anybody has any thoughts, I think that's really the hard thing in community. How do you make space, to use Jennifer's kind of framing? And I'm happy to let that question kind of simmer. I find on these Zoom calls, sometimes it's helpful, you know, you kind of have a question and then you throw another ball into the middle of the circle and we toss maybe both of them around simultaneously, because sometimes it takes a minute to think about that one, but you might have something else. So I'm happy to open it up if there are other questions or reactions that you want to
I see Michelle's
yeah,
unmuted.
You had me at Marvel.
excellent.
It was actually really much more interesting than just loving action movies way too much, but because I realized that that's one of the things I enjoy talking about my two young nephews about, who are 11 and 9. We talk about all the Marvel movies every time something new comes out, and the same with The Mandalorian, and I found there was something present there. What I've loved about them from the beginning is the darkness that exists, and it never completely disappears, which is certainly more our experience. And I want to ask a little bit more about the issue of narrative when it comes to, and this might have been a different chapter, the useful fictions. And then there was a brief mention of boundaries after that. And I think I didn't quite make the connection between the extent of our useful fictions and, which I realize are what you're talking about is how we run into people on a on a daily basis. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, makes me want to grab the book and see how those two things, where those two things kind of intersected, because I'm like, I don't know how those relate actually. I want to ask before I forget, have you been watching Andor? Speaking of So
No,
Mandalorian, it's
yeah.
yet another thing to watch. So I always hesitate to put
I'm not
that
a
on.
Star Wars person. I just happened on The
Okay.
Mandalorian and really
Just happened
liked
on
it.
Mandalorian. Okay.
Yeah.
What got me interested in this topic, and I will not lose the useful fictions piece, because I think that's a good thing for us to chew on also. And it was also something that came up in that group, now that I think about it. I got some, I did a pastoral study project grant from Louisville Institute in 2021, and that formed a lot of the impetus for writing the book. And what I wanted to study, and then my work kind of took a little different direction, is why are dystopian stories so popular right now? Like, there's just so much fiction out there that's very bleak and very kind of end of the world, very apocalyptic stuff. And what is that about? Are we just all in a really bad mood and we don't feel good about where we're heading as a culture, and we want to indulge in these really deeply unsettling kind of situations and stories? And kind of went into some other places with that. But what I find compelling about those kinds of stories is what compels people to go on, even if the traditional ideas of what hope looks like aren't there. And so the idea behind useful fictions is Kwame Appiah, the philosopher who coined this term, and it is what stories do we tell ourselves in order to that allow us to live in purposeful ways? In fact, I was just talking about this from kind of a mental health perspective. There are ways in which thinking about, I think we're in Mental Health Awareness Month. I could be wrong, but I think every month should be Mental Health Awareness Month. But there are ways in which thinking about depression as an illness is accurate and important, because it takes the stigma off of the person. Like you haven't done anything wrong. It's an illness, like diabetes is an illness, and it can be treated in some very particular ways. And that's all very, very true. And there's also, and I can't remember who I ran across in a podcast talking about this, but there's also a way in which that narrative in certain situations, I don't want to say this very carefully, can be disempowering. And so thinking about hope as from a narrative perspective leads me to wonder, how do we tell that story in a way that is most empowering for ourselves and allows us to live most honestly and with integrity and looking to the future as something that is possible for us? And it almost doesn't matter whether it's true or not. It's useful for the living of our days, right? And I think that's what I get out of the idea behind useful fictions. Is it's a dangerous idea in the world of fake news and alternative facts and all of that sort of thing. And I provide a little bit of a disclaimer around that, but I think kind of being playful, I guess, in looking at the world around us, and what if the guy I met in the coffee shop who was getting on my nerves was, on his way to a funeral, and instead of being an obstacle for me, I had the opportunity to just send some love his way. That made a difference in my life. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it changed the way I encountered that situation. And so that's kind of what so the boundary piece, I don't know if there's more, if you want to be more specific in asking that question, but we can dig into that.
I think it was connected to where you were bringing up the stuff from Brene Brown. And, you can imagine the best possible scenarios of people you're encountering, working with.
Got it.
And one could do that and open the doorway for harm to come in, or abuse, or other things.
Yes. I remember that now. Yeah. Yeah, so and that's something that she has pulled out in her work and her way of framing useful fictions. She wouldn't use that terminology, but she says, what if everyone truly is doing the best they can? I think that's probably what the part that you're thinking about, right? Boy, I find that hard. And I think what she found in her research is that the people who feel like that, who really truly believe that people are doing the best they can with the resources that they have, live some of the most open-hearted and wholehearted lives. And she saw herself in a kind of, you know, because she doesn't go there naturally, looking at people much less charitably. So yes, I think like someone had told me one time, you know, all models are wrong, but they're all useful. So thinking about what allows my heart to open to people if I imagine that they truly are with the imperfect life that we've all been given, that this person has been giving, they're doing the best that they can. But it's also incumbent on me to do the best I can, which means not let that be an excuse to be walked all over. And again, quoting Brene, you know, she says, boundaries are what's okay and what's not okay. What boundaries are what allow me to love both me and you. And so someone doing the best they can doesn't mean that they that I don't place some boundaries in place to allow that person not to hurt me, for example. So I think that's really, I think, worth lifting up, Michelle. So it really is a both and. So any thoughts about that, or kind of further questions or comments about? I think that's a good thing to dig into.
Well, just one last thing, and then I'm going to mute myself. It allows one, thinking of boundaries in that way, which is a formulation I've never heard, does allow one to persevere and take that path forward that you talk about in a number of different ways in the book, of taking one next step, the next right thing, breathing into the next moment, focusing on form, all those different things. Boundaries would allow that kind of perseverance. So hope can be manifest in a moment or an action or something. That's very interesting. I'm just thinking out loud.
Thank you. Other comments or questions, pushback or examples? And I'm comfortable with silence too. I have some other thoughts I can bring in, but I would really love to hear some other, what's on your heart or bubbling up. Go ahead, Mary.
Thank you for this book. It's been thought-provoking, and especially what we were just talking about with everybody's doing the best they can really made me come up thinking more about, as a leader in a church, where it seems like it's so hard to get people pulling back into, well, not pulling back, but getting back into some activities and things that they all say they want, but nobody wants to help happen except the pastors. But anyway, I wanted to ask you, was there any particular chapter or section of this book that you found more challenging than others?
That's a good question. Anything in there that connects with the idea of letting go? I mean, I always write the books that I need to read. And so that's why I wrote a book about Sabbath keeping, because there wasn't anything kind of out there that really, I felt like, talked about Sabbath from the perspective of somebody who had little kids at home, and how do you even really do that? And thinking about life as an improvisation and improvisation as a spiritual practice. I wrote that because I am a firstborn Presbyterian Girl Scout who like has some really great plans, and I want to see those through. I don't like living improvisationally. I like knowing what's going to happen and having some level of control. And so I think this was my own, attempt to write myself into a sense of hope as well during a rough few years. And part of the reason I think that I want to decouple hope from things working out in the future is a mantra that my own coach and therapist has worked on with me, which is that you don't know the future, right? So when I start to spin into, oh, this is going bad and this is just going to keep getting worse, and she's like, you don't know the future, and also when I think things are going on a certain trajectory, we don't know the future. And so how can we access hope right now? So I think that's kind of that's not maybe a section, but it's a thread throughout. I think the other piece, thinking about a particular section, is the stuff about the body. I'm a Presbyterian. We love living up in our heads, and thinking about something, I hope, is something that just lives in our entire body, and thinking about trauma and how we carry that around. Thinking about tending to, that hope, that act of self-care is an act of hope. And thinking, Mary, about what you said about your, the congregation, like people want to get back together, but they don't want to sort of volunteer to make that happen, or they don't feel like they have the capacity, or whatever kind of what kind of useful fiction we want to put around that, or how are they doing the best that they can, if we want to go there. There's a lot of, like, I always wonder what people are trying to tell us, or trying to come to terms with themselves when they bump up against that fatigue, right? And that we just have these imperfect, finite vessels, the treasure in clay jars, right? So is there still some, like, it makes me want, is there still some trauma there? Or if we don't want to use that word, that can sometimes be overused, if there's just still some grief there, or whatever. How do we, what would we find out if we interrogated that lovingly? So the question in the chat about hamakom, I cannot remember where I picked that up. It was from, I don't know that it is in the scripture. It might be in, Jewish folk have all the kind of extra textual stuff. And so it might be just handed down from tradition. But the idea that one of the earliest names for God is the place. I wish I had a site for that, but I remember hearing that from in a lecture one time with a Jewish teacher. So if anybody else on the call knows, speak up. But I did see it named as, I've seen that as a name, but I don't know about the earliest name. So, yeah. Other thoughts that are bubbling up for you all? I see Sarah unmuted, and I don't know if that's an invitation. Yeah, come on in.
MaryAnn. Yeah,
Hey.
I don't have a particular question, but I love your book. And I was just thinking that I remember in seminary, I think it was Dykstra, I forget his first name, who talked about ministers as being sleuths of hope, like looking for the hope. We are sleuths. And I raised my hand because Mary Wright is wanting to do something really cool and hopeful in her community, which is to be a shelter, a place for LGBTQIA youth and maybe young adults in Charleston. But I mean, this is delicate, so you can pass, but I just think of you and what it was like for you to have hope for your child as a mother when your child was in depression. And I wondered if you would be willing to share a little bit more about that, because like I want to be a sleuth of hope for younger people, and Mary does. I'm sure we all do, and we don't always know how to do that.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to come at that with like a big picture answer, and then kind of bring it into our family. Just the other day, I was listening to the Food and Faith podcast, which I highly recommend if you're interested in food or faith. They have some really wonderful conversations, and there is a pastor who has written a book about supporting youth around the issue of climate change, which is something that they are going to live with for the whole rest of their lives, which they have a long life ahead of them. And this is going to unutterably change, a lot of what they will come to expect in the world. And one of the things that she said, because she works closely with youth, I think she's in the Bay Area and in California, and so they deal with wildfires all the time, so it's very much there. It's a live issue among the young people that she works with, and she said they don't think in terms of hope. And it's not even that they're hopeless. It's just hope is just not a category or an attribute that they feel like they need to grab onto. It's really, and I've heard this from other people who work in environmental stuff. And so it's interesting to have that, with young people as well. It's really about, what is, and I say this in the book, like what is worth doing even if we won't ultimately succeed. And I call that hope. And they would, and I've talked about this with my own kids, like around issues of justice and environmental justice and other, types of equity and all of these things, is like, this is just the right thing to do. And it may not make a difference, but there's just dignity in the doing of it, even if it doesn't ultimately lead to the big, robust solutions that we are hoping for. And I think to some people that probably feels very modest, like that's not a lot of hope. That's not a lot to hold on to. And this goes back to the question about all these dystopian fictions and stories and movies and TV shows that people are so drawn to, is, but there's something, I think people find inspiration in that. Like the world, even when the world goes to hell, like there's still these people who are trying to do the right thing. And interestingly, that does kind of connect with having a kid with depression. And I will say candidly that, Caroline is our firstborn. We're dealing with that again in some very different ways, but some really hard ways with our middle kid as well. And I have realized recently, and I don't think I'd put it quite this way in the book, the ways that hope can be a burden. Even with all of the right thoughts that I try to have about hope doesn't mean it's all going to work out or it's going to turn out a certain way in the future. There's still kind of even, in my best efforts, there's still kind of a future. And part of that, I mean, I do feel like as parents, as people who work with youth, we have a bigger picture. And when you're a young person, your brain hasn't fully formed. Like everything that's happening right now is just the only thing that will ever happen, right? I mean, they're not done cooking until they're 25 in terms of their brain development. And so in some ways, it's just like, let's just keep these kids alive until 25, right? Because things can get a little more stabilized even just with that, but right. But I just totally lost my train of thought there, thinking about their brains. So yeah, so if hope can become a burden in the sense of if this has to go somewhere, then it's easy for me to unconsciously put expectations on my kid that where you are right now is not okay. And saying where you are right now is not okay isn't the same as saying it's all right that you're depressed. I mean, like we just accept that. But there's a little of that in there, like to say, you don't need to be anything other than who you are. I am here for you right now, as crappy as you feel. And that is enough for today, just to be there. It's kind of what you all were talking about in terms of making room for lament, right? So it's a very hard, I mean, I still think I just struggle with it, right? How much is too much? And when do I need to say, I really do, even if you don't believe you'll feel better, I really do believe you will. I believe this isn't the end of your story, but right now you're in the middle, and where you are right now sucks. And that's just where we are today. So I don't know if that made any sense whatsoever, Sarah, but that's just kind of how I think about that. In a way, letting go of the need to have hope has felt like a freedom to me. The stuff from Miguel de la Torre in the book, he's the Cuban ethicist. He wrote a whole book called Embracing Hopelessness. And it's not a fatalistic book. It's very robust. It's very muscular in terms of like, we are called to be there in radical solidarity with people who are going through the valley of the shadow of death, right? But asking people to sort of have hope or to try to impose hope is a burden that we place on people, and we can place on marginalized communities without realizing it. And that's, a whole maybe separate topic from what you were asking, Sarah. But that feels like freedom to me sometimes, to not have to have hope, but to still be about persevering in this moment. So.
That's such a good point, that we can't impose hope on anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And providing shelter, as Mary's considering doing, can really be enough, can really be life-giving.
And it will lead you to the next step, right? Whatever that might be, but you can't know what, maybe it leads you into advocacy work, and maybe it doesn't, right? But you can't know that until you are present. I mean, to go pick up the point that Michelle is making in chat, right? Radically rooted in the present. Yeah, I would say that's well said. Yeah. Yes. RP 764.
Well, we can't impose our hope on anyone no more than we can impose salvation. But what we can be is the light that's around them at the moment. If we're talking about other people, we can be the drinking fountain, if you will, on a hot summer day in a park. But dealing with somebody that's, that's going through an enormous amount of grief, coming to them and, telling them with big smiles and everything like that, oh, don't worry about it, everything's going to be okay, is counterproductive. It just doesn't work. But you have to sit there on the outside, being a moon, if you will, and being constant with them. And whether their troubles are from grief or the heartache of not being accepted of any individual or group that's marginalized, but you can be there. And like I said, being a drinking fountain, well, a cool breeze, that sometimes is enough.
Yeah.
But it's dealing with something like that is a very multifaceted problem. And no one solution is there. So we have to be there. And as the problems come to us, or as the situations come to us, we can deal with that and those individuals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's well said. Yeah, this is a weird reference, but it reminds me of that scene from Inside Out, the Pixar movie that's about the teenage girl with all the emotions that are living in her head, and Joy just kind of has this relentlessness, to her, that's trying to kind of buck up this Riley, this little girl that these 5 emotions live within. And there's another character, and at one point the character that's in Riley's head's very sad, and so Joy sits down, or is like, hey, let's go, and then sadness sits down with this character. And what strikes me about that scene, if you've seen it, is, I mean, he's very sad. He's a piece of Riley's past. He was kind of an imaginary friend that she's starting to forget, and he's really sad. And Joy's like, it'll be okay, and just practically trying to drag him because they need to go do a thing over here. And sadness, it doesn't take that long. I mean, yes, it's a movie, but she sits and she's like, gosh, that sounds like that was really hard. You really are going to miss her, and you had some great times together. And they just sit, and it's just a short thing. I mean, and I know sometimes it's not a short process, it's not a quick process, but we make it sometimes more complicated than it is, which is just simply to say, I hear you. And that's enough just for that moment. So thank you for lifting that up. And I love the images that you lifted up too, of the drinking fountain and the moon. I mean, those are just beautiful.
It's one of the things that my mentors along the way have urged me, but thankfully they haven't, beat me severely about my head and chest, but just been gentle and kind of just nudged me here and there. I have had some, which one of them at the moment is in the upper left-hand corner. I believe Miss Jennifer.
Yes. Right.
But how I deal with people that are on the marginalized side has come about because of maturity and faith. And my hope resides here.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that through the word, I've been told that life's not going to be easy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It didn't work out real well for the apostles
Mm-hmm.
and all the thousands of Christians in the time.
Mm-hmm.
So why would I expect perfection here when my hope is someplace else? But you can't just walk up to people and explain that to them when they're in a dark spot, because it will not make sense to them.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well said. Well said. What else is bubbling up for people? Beautiful questions and reflections, really thoughtful. Kathleen?
Hi.
Hi.
Somewhat related to the comment that Michelle put in the chat a little while ago about being radically rooted in the present. One of the stories that really resonated with me, where I am in my life right now, caring for someone who's dying, was the story about driving in the pouring rain and, wanting to know, like, when is this going to end, and sort of being focused on that end point, but then having the awareness and the intention to just kind of focus on driving. and being in that place without knowing what comes next. And I know you said this is today's best, and that's okay. And, you know, that's kind of a mantra that I've been saying a lot. And I'll also throw out that I liked your image somewhat earlier in the book about putting your phone in low power mode and, you know, using that as just kind of a way to persist and to keep moving forward, not just gutting it out, but to keep moving.
Yeah. It connects in some ways, thank you for that, Kathleen, to what Michelle was saying about boundaries, right? I mean, just being really present to your own need for your own self-care. One of the things that I really hope we will not let go of from the pandemic, especially those early days, is just on gatherings like this, you know, people would say, how are you doing? And they'd really, you could tell people really were asking sincerely, not in that we're just at the beginning of a conversation and this is what you say kind of way. And because we don't know, we can't go full out all the time if we don't know how long. In fact, you know, speaking of the pandemic, I wrote this early on, but I was inspired by someone else who brought up this metaphor that, like, we didn't know how long we would be locked down and doing the things we were having to do. And so people said, well, it's a relay, right? You know, you kind of do what you can and then you let somebody else go for a while. Someone else said, this is a marathon. This is going on a lot longer than we thought. And there's a kind of a race it's an ultra race, which anything over a marathon length is considered an ultra marathon. But the way it works is everyone runs a specific loop, like a 4-mile loop, the one that I'm familiar with, and everybody just keeps doing that until there's only one person left. It's called a backyard ultra, I think it is the name of it. And there's this crazy guy in Tennessee who came up with this. But it's become a kind of world famous race. In fact, the New York Times just did an article about the Ukrainian team and how they were training for this backyard ultra, even with everything going on. I mean, talk about hope, and just such an amazing example of hope. But that's kind of what we don't know how long the race ultimately will be. It's determined by the people who run it, you know, and then just when there's just one person left, that's how long it was. We didn't know. So you run that differently than you do. Oh, hello, Kitty. I was on sabbatical this summer, and maybe some of you got pandemic puppies. I got a sabbatical kitten. So here she's visiting us now. We don't know how long this race will be. And so we run it differently as a result. We walk a lot, we take breaks, we, you know, ask for people to help us keep us awake in the middle of the night. You know, I mean, it goes all hours, this thing. And I think that I find a lot of hope in that, and a lot of inspiration in that as well.
And gosh, when you Google backyard ultra, you get strategies, you get 7 top tips to go the distance.
That's right. That's right.
You know,
that's right.
I think, MaryAnn, one of the things I so much appreciated about this book was how your vocation and your avocations just shine through. You know, the running piece. I'm so glad you alluded to that. As someone who only ever aspires to run and will never get that off my bucket list. I loved reading about the images and the experiences of running. And I think one of the things also that I appreciated so very much about this book were the very simple, beautiful one sentence, two sentence practices at the end of each devotional moment in this book. Your coaching just shines through in those practices. It's like having a hope coach. Thank you for that. This is
Thank
not a
you.
question, it's just more, fangirling.
Well, it takes one to know one, because you are a very gifted coach as well. So, but I'm really humbled and grateful that came through, because I said this in the sermon last Sunday. I don't know if you know it's an old New Yorker cartoon. It's one of my mom's favorites, because my mom is a Unitarian Universalist who dabbles in the Presbyterians pretty often, but Unitarians love to discuss things, and the cartoon is like an escalator up to heaven. And actually there are two escalators. One of them is the escalator to heaven, and then the other one that has a lot more people on it is discussion about heaven. And we love to talk about these things, right? I mean, that's not unique to Unitarian Universalists. Presbyterians love to be up in our heads. And sometimes it does feel like we'd rather talk about it than experience it. So I really tried for this to be a book that is to be experienced. And I need to do that for myself as well. I mean, again, I don't know any writer that doesn't write the book that they need to read. Just as we as preachers, I mean, aren't we always kind of preaching the sermon that we need as well? And we just hope and pray that the Holy Spirit is working in it so that it's something that other people resonate with as well. So I wanted to, because I love to keep the conversation going, I wanted to just put in the chat, for those who are not connected to my newsletter, I write a little reflection every Friday morning. It's published every Friday. The one for this week is already finished and ready to go. And what I'm doing right now might be of interest to those of you who are, I mean, all of us as church people. I've just decided to do a little series, a 3-week series about planning and discernment, like just some tools and things that I've picked up as a coach and other things. So I commend that to you. If you need a little inspiration on your Friday mornings, it's there. And yeah, so any final thoughts?
I was just curious about the cover, how you selected it and what it represents.
The publisher, Erdman's, works with some graphic designers, and they came up with 4 designs for me. And I really agonized over it, because I am a word person. I'm not a visual person. And and they're very different. That one is the most abstract. So there was one that had a bunch of people on it, but most of them had that kind of archway. And I honestly don't know. It was fun to kind of run it by family and say, what do you see in this? They liked the kind of tangled aspects of that abstract design around the outside, to kind of say it's complicated. There's some nuance to what we're going to be doing in the book. And I also, I just got back from Scotland this summer. So I'm thinking all things Celtic, and Celtic knots. There's a little bit of that in there too, I think, as I look at it, but I think it's kind of open to interpretation. But
I see the meditative practice of Zen tangling in the design. And to me, it speaks of that meditative practice and the endlessness of the conversation about hope. I love that.
Yeah.
Is it too soon to ask you what's percolating?
Percolating?
What else you're working on?
It's not too soon, but it's not very well formed yet. I I've been thinking, I mean, I like I said, I went on sabbatical this summer, and one of the things that we did is my husband and I went to Scotland and we walked the John Muir Way, which is a trail that goes west to east across the kind of the skinnier part of Scotland. So it was 134 miles. We took about 11 days to do it. It was so wonderful. The weather was perfect. We were there before it got really hot, and we had a baggage transfer. So we just had little day packs. And when we got to each B&B along the way, there were our bags and our massage thing for our legs and, you know, all of that. It was really wonderful, but it renewed a kind of interest in studying Celtic spirituality and Celtic Christianity. And there's been a lot written on that. So I don't know whether I have anything new to say about it, but I am thinking about it in terms of, it's just been a personal interest of mine to renew that. And in fact, here's a little denominational plug. I just saw that Presbyterians Today has its Advent calendar is on Celtic, is Celtic spiritual, Celtic Advent, I think it's called. So again, I'm really captivated by thinking about a Christianity that is inflected by love of the earth and seeing God in creation, which is certainly not anything new for us. And it's, you know, but as we think about climate and how we are good stewards, I wonder if there's more that we can mine there. So that's where I am so far. But if you're interested in that, that'll be showing up in the newsletter in the Blue Room. So, because that's where everything kind of begins as I think about writing something new. So.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Getting lots of thank yous in the chats and regrets from people who had to leave early.
Yes.
If you're okay, MaryAnn, I didn't tell you about lingering in the narthex, but if you're
sure,
willing
I got a couple minutes.
Stay for a couple of minutes. I don't think we've ever kept anybody more than just a few moments.
Yeah.
But I want to say thank you again to you for being such a wonderful hope coach.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to each of you. Gosh, you know, one of the amazing perks, blessings of serving in this role is having the fun of knowing just a little bit about your backstories and what you bring to conversations, Presbyterian of Wabash Valley. And I love the Presbyterian of Southeastern Illinois more than I know you all anymore, but I'm so grateful to my colleague Rebecca Blair for jumping on this and saying this would be a fun thing to collaborate on. And may I say, in the presence of witnesses, I hope this is the first of many times that we will work on things together.
Amen.
Thanks.
Amen and amen.
Thanks everybody for
Yes.
being with us. This is the grace and peace and the benediction before you hang out in the narthex if you wish. Thanks for being here. I look forward to seeing all of you in lots of different places, but especially when we get back together for lunch and learn and listen on Thursday, November 10th. So thanks very much, everyone. Take good care.
All right. Great. Oh, Jennifer, you're muted.
Vicki, if you would stop the recording or let me host, and I'll stop the recording, one or the other, in case people have souls to bear here that they don't want
Yeah, right.
broadcast all over.